Hold on this computer. Okay. So, hello, Bjørn.
Hi.
And I'd like to first ask you, who are you? So, a basic, simple question to start with.
Yeah, I mean, we're starting with the big existential questions that will have me spiraling off into like a full-blown existential crisis here.
Hopefully not, but if needed, I can be of help. Hopefully, but just to, if you could say a few words about your activities, your interests, whatever seems important.
So the Cliff Notes is basically, I'm Bjørn. I'm from Norway, currently residing in Sweden. Have been bouncing a little bit around the world, living in places like Turkey and the UK. My work is largely to try to create healthier societies, whatever I mean by that.
Yeah, well, what do you mean by that, if you don't mind me interrupting?
Essentially societies in which people communicate better with each other and collaborate better, interact with each other in ways that are not destructive. And a lot of my background for doing that is that I've been working a lot with violent extremism and radicalization into extremism. Been working with former extremists, trying to understand how they came to become extremists and how they stopped being extremists again. And then working now in this enormously polarized world that we all live in, and trying to make sense of it all, but also try to help people and organizations make sense of it in order to find better ways of communicating and collaborating so we can all work together for a better future.
And any luck in that?
Connection is like semi-bad, but
yeah, well, I think it's okay. It's yes, there are some interruptions, but I think it's working now. So how is that going, if you don't mind me asking?
So, I mean, at
working with
at various levels, it goes in various ways, right? So working directly with individuals is
yes, that's my question.
Fairly okay. Working with smaller groups and smaller teams is okay, but then right now you see, because of the way politics is shaping us, the way in which media and social media is influencing the way in which we think and the way in which we think about each other, really. Things are getting tense. You see families kind of breaking up over things like politics, which used to not drive families apart in that way. So in some ways that's quite damaging. At the same time, I have a lot of faith in people and a lot of faith in communities, and I think we are able to come together and work together when we have to.
So what's the most important discovery in your work, working with these individuals? Like the reasons.
I really can't.
Sorry, I think it does. Yes, I think we've connection isn't that great, but let's see how it goes. Yeah, my internet.
Yeah, I'm trying to make out what you're saying.
Yeah, it's the connection isn't great. It's and now it's frozen. Hello, Bjørn. Are you there? Oh, it's.
Hello.
Hello. Yes. I'm still here, and
good. I just tried reconnecting to better network, but I don't know if that's working. So yeah, sorry about
that. No worries.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll just see how it goes.
Yeah.
So my question was about any discoveries, any insights in why you think people. And I know it's a terrible question because it's a very broad question, and we could be probably discussing it for many hours here. But what is do you think is the main cause for people, the people you're working with, for them becoming so extreme in their views and behaviors?
I think largely it's an experience or a feeling of not being heard and seen by those surrounding ones. So a lot of the people who become radicalized don't feel that they have a sense of belonging is kind of what we call it. But then what does sense of belonging really mean, right? And to a large extent, it seems to mean that people aren't interested in their perspective and don't really even want to consider their perspectives. And when asking questions about why society is the way it is and things like that, kind of mainstream society has a tendency to blatantly dismiss people who are kind of seeing the world from a different perspective and who are outsiders in some sort of ways, while extremist groups are good at tapping into those people and giving easy answers and giving space for people with weird ideas. And then that becomes kind of the place in which some people live, or their community, and largely that isolates them also through active means from kind of mainstream society, where extreme ideas in mainstream society should meet resistance because like people in general are fairly sane, but within these kind of smaller extreme communities, they don't meet that resistance, and thus that can have fatal consequences, as we've seen in various terrorist attacks, etc., around the world. But it's also damaging to the individuals who are being radicalized, right? They are being isolated from the rest of the world, and they don't feel that they belong in this world in the same way that you and I hopefully do.
Yes, we're fairly sane as well. I guess.
So I mean, it becomes a sort of a mechanism where the fact that you are seeing the world differently becomes a self-reinforcing kind of mechanism.
So practically, how do you work with them?
So the first step is largely to listen to people, seeing them, making sure that they understand that you don't agree with them, but that you at least hear them and are willing to listen to different perspectives. And I think one of the things that has kind of changed in the world over since basically Facebook and Google became a thing is our willingness to listen to each other. I mean, like humans have always had a tendency to speak more than we listen, but in the age of Instagram and YouTube and Facebook posts and scrolling on Twitter, we are all becoming broadcasters. And in that context, like some of us are going to have bigger and smaller followings, etc. But we also tend to broadcast to people who largely agree with us. We tend to be selective about who we are following or listening to or discussing with in the first place. That becomes even easier when you have kind of the filtering mechanisms of social media, etc. So it's a complex thing where human nature is also being kind of reinforced because we are selective about who our friends are. And like we tend to as human beings, since like we first sat around the bonfires and discussed stories of the world, sit with people who agreed more with us about how the world functions, right? And we still do that largely, but now it's becoming very reinforced, and it's becoming very easy to become isolated as either an individual or as a group from the rest of society that has a different way of interpreting the world. So yeah, it's about fighting isolation and making people feel the sense of belonging and sense of value by being heard and seen, and making sure that becomes part of a process of coming out of a damaging community, or not going down the route of joining a damaging community in the first place, right?
So what motivates you personally, besides your personal story experience, but like these days? Because to me, it seems like a challenging type of work.
Yeah. So I mean, at kind of a systemic level, like societies are falling apart, communities are falling apart. We have higher levels of polarization between like even political parties, within political parties, etc. Now than we've seen in the past. We see that countries are isolating themselves largely, which is unfortunate. And kind of this world of collaboration that I very much believe in is seemingly kind of breaking into pieces. And a lot of my work is with organizations like the European Union and the United Nations. And I mean, my late mentor was Kofi Annan, who led the UN in kind of a important period as well. And so like I'm a strong believer in international collaboration. And we aren't even able to collaborate kind of within relatively small units now, and even less so perhaps at kind of international level. And so really what's driving me now is kind of trying to piece it all back together, and do what I can to make us all try to collaborate for building a world in which we all can thrive, and we all can live with dignity and opportunities. So, I mean, those are massive goals, but it starts with each and every one of us. And so, like, taking it from that individual level to grassroots communities and through to local communities and up to governmental and intergovernmental levels. I think like the systemic thinking about bringing diverse voices to the table, listening to people who are not exactly the same as you. Like these are things that are challenging and sometimes painful, but sometimes we have to go through things that are challenging and painful in order to grow. And I want humanity to ultimately grow, right? So, yeah.
And since I'm a big fan of the whole compassion approach, not only in the psychotherapeutic dimension. So how do you personally understand this term? Or practically, how do you understand it?
So, I mean, compassion is a challenging word, like so many of the other words I've been working with. I was part of, or I am still part of something called the Forgiveness Project, in which we discuss the concept of forgiveness, which of course is tied to compassion. But I often discuss that in the context of reconciliation, which is about acknowledging that something bad has happened, and that was bad, but then figuring out how to move on from that and how to live on from that. And I think compassion is largely about the same thing. It's about acknowledging each other, acknowledging each other's struggles, and acknowledging each other's reality. Like I speak with a lot of people with ideas that are very strange in kind of most of our kind of worldview, but a lot of those people are people who genuinely struggle with things, and I think quite often we have like a tendency to dismiss people we disagree with blatantly and say, no, you're wrong. But I think even if your interpretation of reality doesn't match with my interpretation of reality, you're coming from a different background and perspective, and I think we have a tendency to not be open to that. And I mean, like we're talking about things like when speaking about white privilege, for instance, in the American context, it is kind of a very clear and internationally known.
Not only in that context, you know.
yeah, but like, how do you explain to someone who is white but who struggles to put food on the table that they are coming from a position of privilege purely by being natural born citizens in the US? And I think like I see that as a privilege, but for a lot of people who are in that situation, it doesn't feel like they are coming from a privileged position, right? And I can understand that if you struggle to put food on the table, you don't see yourself as particularly privileged. But that's because we have different ways of interpreting. Well, we have different ways of interpreting what we mean by privilege, right? And I think if we just sat down and listened to each other and talked openly, then like that would get us a long way in understanding each other better. My perspective is largely also coming from my background as kind of a storyteller. So I started off when I was 16 working in film for reconciliation and using documentary film as a tool for bringing together diverse communities, and went on to study theater and theater production. And so my perspective is always that like we as human beings are a result of the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and the world around us. And those stories are influenced by the stories we hear around us, but also by our experiences and how we choose to interpret those experiences, and whether those are experiences we ourselves live or experiences we learn from others through other people's stories. Like at the end of the day, we are all, or societies is all informed by stories, and we can tell good stories and we can tell bad stories. But we can also learn from each other's stories. And I like listening to people and understanding their struggles is really key in understanding where they are coming from and why they think the way they are thinking. And then that also becomes a better framework for understanding how to help them tell stories that are healthier to themselves and their communities, right?
But I think what we're doing right now is very rare, and goes back to what you've been saying. Just having a conversation like that without any particular or any specific purpose. Just having an authentic, genuine conversation, because you want to listen and learn from one another. So these days,
I don't think like without an agenda is necessarily like what I would label it as. Like my agenda is always to try to understand people better and try to figure out ways in which that can help communities thrive. Individuals within those communities thrive. Like how do we make your world, which also happens to be my world, better, right? So it's like I'm serving myself by like trying to make the world better, but hopefully also serving you, right?
So this this idea, this insight that we are all interconnected. That's what what came up when you were saying that.
We're all interconnected, but we're also so much better when we are working together than when we're working alone, right? And I think like one of the things that we tend to forget is that if we only listen to ourselves, if the only stories we tell are stories about ourselves, and if the only stories we hear are stories about ourselves, then we won't get inspired to do new things. We won't evolve, and we won't develop new ideas. And really, in order to develop any at all as kind of humans and as humanity, in order to learn, in order to grow, we need to stand on each other's shoulders, and we can't do that if we're not listening to each other either. And so like basically from sitting around the campfires again in like the 10,000 years ago times, and I think like communication is really the key to why humanity has done so well as species, but also something we need to maintain actively and keep a healthy relationship with in order to continue growing and making this world good, both for humans and for all the other creatures and life we're sharing this planet with, which we seem to not be great at these days. Right?
Yeah, there's several examples come to mind. Yes.
Yeah.
So last question. I promise. Knowing how busy you are. So what brings you joy personally, Bjørn?
What brings me joy?
An easy question. It's just an easy question.
I mean, stories.
Stories. Okay.
Come back to that. Art, music, films. Relaxing and watching Netflix, like it all
okay.
happens from time to time.
Yes, I've done that today.
That sounds good. I've been working since 5 a.m. this morning. That was good. But yeah, so I'm a little bit loopy already.
There are new movies out on Netflix, so you can have a break now. I guess you
more stories to enjoy. But really, I think like human creativity, and we have so much to offer each other, and that's really cool. But then humans sometimes get exhausting with all their stories, so I really enjoy spending time with animals as well, and just alone in the forest where I have set up camp and live. So yeah, it's depends on my day what brings me joy. So I would be terrible to Marie Kondo. I like to surround myself with books and such.
Yeah, well, have a look, in the back. Yes, yeah.
Definitely. So all of the things that spark joy are so many things. Yeah. There's enough joy to go around. So.
So thank you for sharing your ideas and your stories with me. And
thank you for giving me the space to do that.
my absolute pleasure. And I'll stop recording now.
All right.
And